I was asked to do this, and I said to Colin Wagstaff, the indefatigable member of the WFA who does these things, I said, well, I don't know anything about Scarborough, I don't know anything about the Navy, you know, I'm a sort of main war on land kind of a guy. But he said, no, you should be able to do something on this. And I thought, okay, I'll have a go. And during the process of doing the research for this paper, I became fascinated with Scarborough because it became something which was much bigger than the sum of its parts, much bigger than just a coastal raid. In fact, it's my proposition that it marks, to an extent, to a degree, the beginning of what we might call total war, the difference between a limited wars that we see before the 20th century and then the total wars of the 20th century that we see in the First, the Second World War, and also later on in Vietnam. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Scarborough and the transition to total war. Well, the photograph here, we can just see here, that was taken there. That was taken outside the Pavilion Hotel in Scarborough in November of 1918, and it refers to the events of the 16th of December 1914. It's got two slogans on it. Remember Scarborough and feed the guns. And these two statements, I think, effectively bookend the war and demonstrate this paradigm shift that's occurred between 1914 and 1918. Now, it marked a transition from this pre-20th century concept of a limited war to that of a total war, about which I'll talk about in a minute. Yeah? Remember, Scarborough marks the beginning of this transition, and if you like, feed the guns, because the First World War became about feeding the guns, illustrates the industrial reality of that transformation. So let me see if my posh thing works, and it does. Decoding the Scarborough Raid. What does it mean? Well, the raid on Scarborough, it's a portent of, it's also an agent as well, and it's also an example of this transition from limited war to total war. And the raid itself is a curious mixture of the modern and the anachronistic. We have the use of very modern technology, especially when we look at the two German cruisers involved. We have the overwhelming power of the artillery itself, the enormous power of those guns, which we'll see again replicated on the Western Front. On the other hand, it's really quite old-fashioned. It's been some 200 years since there's been any coastal raiding in Britain. So in that respect, it really does hark back to a previous time. And it achieved absolutely nothing militarily. The raid and naval power more generally did not achieve a decision, because this is what the early part of this is what 1914 was all about. All the belligerents believed they could achieve a decision. They knew that modern technology, the introduction of fast-firing artillery, the introduction of breech-loading rifles, magazine-fed, machine guns, would make the battlefield and war a more dangerous place, but they felt that a decision, a grand battle, or a grand engagement on the sea would decide the course of the war. And by the time we get to the end of 1914, we realise that it's not going to decide the course of this war at all. And this war would be a long, long haul. Now, there were unforeseen consequences of a failure to achieve the decision on the Western Front in 14, which were profound. And these unforeseen consequences of the Scarborough Raid were also quite profound. Let me move on. What is total war? I've gone about total war and limited war. What is total war? Well, the phrase total war was coined by Erich von Ludendorff in his book Der Totalkrieg in 1935. Erich von Ludendorff was also better known in the First World War as the commander-in-chief of the German forces from 1916 till 1918, replacing Falkenhayn on the west. The definition by Hugh Bucheno in the Oxford Companion to Military History is total war is one in which the whole population and all the resources of the combatants are committed to complete victory and thus themselves become military targets. That's quite a sweeping definition. So it's probably more instructive to look at the indicators of total war, the elements that make up total war. So, doing this, let's have a look at these elements. The elements we've got are, it is typically national in character, involving the entire population of a nation. The nation state had grown to its peak at the beginning of the 20th century. So it would be almost natural that wars fought would be done by a nation and its population. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant is blurred or removed entirely. We are all combatants in a total war. Science and industry are mobilized by the state on a national scale and even international scale, given Britain's empire position, to maximize war material output. There is a lack of restraint in military actions. That's another one of the keys. We see the terror bombing in World War II, we see Scarborough, we see a whole host of other accusations of atrocity, of not playing the game. Quite simply, we've gotten serious now, and therefore such niceties as morals tend to get swept out of the way. Battles themselves, individual battles, are indecisive, and the outcome tends to be decided by attrition, fighting in the long haul. This we see definitely in World War I. There is also a suspension, or at least a gradual suspension, of social, political, and legal norms that we're all used to. We see mass armies of citizen soldiers. That's the expression of the nation in khaki, as it were. We see a strong ideological element is required to justify that mass participation. The great power needs of Britain are not enough to weld the population together and give them what's known as the will to war. They need an ideological premise. And in this case, we see liberalism versus militarism. There is also, tends to be, a demand for unconditional surrender. These are not mere party games before we get down to the real business around a conference table. These are fights to the end now. And also, because there is a demand for unconditional surrender, capitulation is not an option. They will keep fighting. And the mobilization of an entire nation and its resources for the pursuit of total victory. Now, we didn't have this in 1914, in fact, quite the opposite. But by the time we get to 1918, we most definitely do. I'm going to turn now to the raid itself. I'm not going to look at the detail of the raid. I'm just going to look at some elements which gives an idea of this transformation, this shift over. I've got a picture there is of the barracks, the castle yard during the bombardment, which is probably the only military target in the entire town which actually got hit. One of the questions I'd like to ask is, why did the Germans raid the East Coast? It's an important question because, again, it articulates this difference between total war and also limited war. Was it revenge for the Falkland Islands? The Germans have recently suffered a defeat there. Very possibly. Was it an attempt to draw out the British fleet and then at least attack a part of that fleet because of the imbalance between the German fleet and the British fleet? Was it the last hurrah for an old order, an old way of looking at things? Well, we have two people involved in this. We had Admiral Ingenhol. He wanted to provoke the British into a decisive naval battle. That's how he saw warfare. He believed if he could defeat the British fleet, then this would either end the war or would be the first step, as it were, towards the final end of that war. It would be of such significance. Admiral Pole, who was involved in the raid and became Ingenhol's successor, had a very different point of view. He wanted to save the surface fleet and use the ruthless application of unrestricted U-boat warfare to attack British supply lines. Now that's interesting because one perspective sees it in terms of a traditional engagement. The other perspective sees it in terms of wearing down a nation's ability to fight through the use of submarines. Now, maybe the action was defined by circumstances, because there's an argument to say that basically the east coast of Yorkshire was the only place that the German raiders could hit in order to try and draw out the British, because of the presence of minefields, cheap and cheerful minefields, which made it very, very difficult for these giant capital ships to operate. And finally, was it an attempt to instill terror and panic into the civil population? This certainly becomes of great import during the 1930s with the idea that the bomber will always get through, i.e. the bomber which will terrorise the population of Britain into surrender in the Second World War. We're turning now to the ships, not because I'm a particular sort of a naval geek or anything like that. If it floats on the sea, to me it's a boat. My brother-in-law was a retired ex-Navy captain, and I take great delight in saying, did you go sail any boats while you were in the Navy? Which used to send him into absolute apoplexy. Now, there were two main cruisers involved in this, battle cruisers. There was also another ship as well, but the two main architects of the damage to Scarborough were, firstly, the ship SMS Derfflinger. Now, the SMS Derfflinger was a battle cruiser. It was launched on the 17th of July 1913, so it's a very, very modern, state-of-the-art piece of kit. It was faster than anything else. It had a longer cruising range, more armament, and heavier armament than before. Its armament was, of course, the guns, and it packed a hell of a punch. It had 8 12-inch guns, 12 5.9-inch guns, they were the ones that we used mostly in the actual bombardment itself, 8 3.5-inch guns, and also 4 8.8-centimetre flak guns. As I said, it was a state-of-the-art, high-tech battle cruiser. Yeah? And it was a product of the naval race. The naval race itself was one of the reasons, if we like, that Britain becomes increasingly engaged in the possibility of war. So, make this clear, this is a piece of high-tech, brand-new kit. It expresses everything about Germany. It's something of national pride, and it's also a very deadly weapon. The other ship was the SMS Von der Tann. It too was a battle cruiser. Launched on the 20th of March 1909, a little bit older than Derflinger, but we are talking about a relatively brand new ship. It was designed in response, actually, to the British Invincible class ships, these new dreadnoughts that were coming through, though it has slightly smaller guns than the British one. It's the fastest in its class at the time. It is a greyhound of a battle cruiser. Again, it has longer range and it's much more heavily armoured than the British ships. Again, it's that punch it packs that matters. 8 11-inch guns, 10 5.9-inch guns, 16 3.5-inch guns. Again, a piece of high-tech military craft, a product of the arms race and a state-of-the-art. Now, these high-tech ships were indeed the products of advanced science and industry. This was the product of the second industrial revolution. If the first industrial revolution ushered in the aim of steam and power, the second one was that which managed it and made it more effective and more efficient. Ironically, these high-tech pieces of kit were obsolete in terms of the war that was coming. They were effectively the last hurrah of this bygone age of warfare. They hark back to a time when decisive engagement could settle matters. The scope of employment was severely limited by new mass-produced cheap technologies such as the sea mine and the torpedo. So they can no longer rule the waves as they would have done once before. And now they really change to demonstrations of technological and industrial prowess and symbols of national pride. But a future advanced war-winning weapon, they are most definitely not. They are vital to the maintenance of national morale and also, therefore, to the will to war. But they are too precious to risk. We have the mines. We have the possibility of being trounced by the British fleet themselves. So instead of it being a decisive military engagement, the possibility of losing your surface fleet becomes a morale issue, one that could really seriously dent the morale of an entire nation. Well, what were the consequences of the raid once we've looked beyond these obsolete pieces of high-tech kit? Well, the military results were trifling. They really were absolutely pathetic, especially when we look at the scale of the war as it unfolds, and especially when we compare it to the scale of the war in France and Flanders. It very much embarrassed the Royal Navy. Apparently the Royal Navy had decided to let them raid the East Coast. They knew they were going to do so, and then they were going to catch them on the way back. However, they managed to slip away into the fog and the darkness. The other results, though, are the most important results, and this is where we see Scarborough as something more than just a coastal raid. There was domestic and international outrage at this. There was dramatically increased national and international support for the war, and that support continued on and on and on, and was particularly important in terms of swaying America, if not into the war, then certainly into what you might call a positive neutrality, which benefited the Allies at the expense of the Germans. It confirmed, or provided extra evidence, if you like, Britain's and France's claim to the International Court of Opinion that the Germans really were barbarians. Peter Doyle mentioned the medals with culture on and all the rest of it, yeah? And this really fed into this idea that the Germans really were barbarians, and their version of culture was certainly one that modern advanced nations could never, ever accept. It allowed Churchill to make his famous baby killers speech about the Germans. I suppose it's every politician's dream under circumstances like this to be able to fairly point the finger at the enemy and say, they are baby killers. Because indeed, we do see the death of small children. It dramatically boosted voluntary recruitment, even if that was only for a short period of time, and it was a colossal propaganda coup for the British. It provided an ideological casus belli for the people. That means a reason for war. They were fighting not so much against the for great power issues, but for the reasons of morality, for decency. And these link very closely with the idea of a liberal democratic Britain. The press and international opinion. Certainly after the Boer War, which began to demonstrate it certainly to the British press and people, the power of the press. By the time we get to 1914, that power has become global. The international reaction was very rapid and quite extraordinary. I was really quite knocked out when I did some research on this the other day. Now, Room 40 and the London press recognised the propaganda value immediately and went into overdrive. We've already heard mentioned that the British were particularly good at propaganda. They were superb. German propaganda efforts were extraordinarily crude compared with the subtleties of British propaganda, which really operated according to control, who has control of the press, the placing of stories, and, if you like, not going overboard on the atrocity, but letting people draw their own conclusions themselves. Now, the most important market for this was America. By the way, for those of you who don't know what Room 40 was, Room 40 was the, if you like, the central hub, the centre of the spider's web for Britain's propaganda effort, for its spying effort, so on and so forth, because the whole thing was interlinked. Now, America is the target market for this. It sounds quite terrible saying target market, but this is total war, or at least the beginnings of. And the acid test for penetration of any story is to what extent it features in the otherwise insular and indifferent world of Middle America. It was the same in the Vietnam War when Nixon mentioned, what does white picket fence America think about the war? Not what these hippies think about the war, or the ultra eagles, but about this market of this great vast lump, which is so important in terms of what America does and how it supports. Now, the story is distributed very, very rapidly indeed. The events of the morning of the 16th of December were being read across the United States in the 16th of December evening issues. That's how fast that they worked. And I just got some examples here. I've deliberately chosen what you might call fairly obscure newspapers here. We have this one up here. This is the Rock Island Argus. We also have the Star Independent, which is from Harrisburg. We have the Tacoma Times, and we have the East Oregonian here. These are not the Washington Post. They are not the New York Times. These are the papers of Middle America. And as we can see, it is splashed across the front of every single issue. And that goes, of course, for the rest of the newspapers in America as well. So there was a very, very deep penetration right into the heart of America. The people who were insular tended to ignore the outside world and were therefore, if you like, the greatest stumbling block to getting America on board under the cause of the Allies in one way or form. The reach is global beyond America as well. I've just taken one example here. It made the Italian newspaper Il Messaggero on, again, the 16th of December 1914, evening issues, and it wrote, I tedeschi diventano massacratori di bambini di Scarborough. The Germans can now be known as the baby killers of Scarborough. I wonder whether Churchill actually got the idea from the Italian newspaper. Again, this is important on the larger scale of things, because in 1915, Italy decides to join the Allies. At this particular time, it is uncertain whether it's going to join the Central Powers or whether it's going to join the Allies. And stories like this, do make a difference overall in terms of decisions that are made. And the story did not end the following day. These did not become just chippy wrappers, as it were. It ran and ran and ran. In fact, its longevity is really quite extraordinary. During January 1915, when they were doing reviews of the year, I just picked some at random here, the Caldwell Tribune of Caldwell, Idaho, the Western Liberal of Lordsburg, New Mexico, Rock Island Argus, the Appeal, and the Tulsa Daily World of the Indian Territory in Oklahoma all ran front-page stories about Scarborough on their January editions. In all, 60 different US newspapers mentioned Scarborough on their front page during January of 1915 when reviewing the year. Indeed, on the 24th of September of 1915, we're now pushing nearly a year later, the incredible Maupan Times of Oregon, and I looked up where Maupan was, and it seems to consist of around about 4 chicken hutches and maybe one shop in the middle of what was otherwise a desert. They ran a piece on the history of Scarborough called Scarborough, a Famous Resort, which featured photographs of the damage. And I'm absolutely certain that the good citizens of, of Maupin are not particularly interested on the seaside virtues of Scarborough and isn't going to be their #1 holiday destination. So it gives us some idea of how they managed to keep this story going. Indeed, a very minor attack by a German submarine on Scarborough on the 4th of September 1917 still made the front page of both the El Paso Herald and the Washington Post. And at every opportunity, remember Scarborough is thrown up. Here we have, for example, 13 killed, this is from the Evening World in Oregon, 13 killed, 12 women in sweep of Zeppelins along the British coast. If we like, we see the Zeppelin taking over from the coastal raid, but the effect is pretty much the same. And the very end of all of this, written at the bottom, it says, if I can read it here, a bombardment of Hartlepool, Scarborough and Whitby by German warships several months ago cost the lives of 177 civilians, 567 persons were wounded. It's a constant reminder of Scarborough, of remember Scarborough, of the attack on the East Yorkshire coast. Why was there such press interest in this? Well, for a start, we've got British influence and the propaganda drive. It's one of those areas of the war which we need to study in much, much greater detail, but we were very, very good at this. Partly because we already had a relationship with the East Coast of America and their major newspapers there, especially the New York Times, but also because we tended to be a lot more subtle about how we went about things. Now, the story itself is published alongside and within the context of reports of German atrocities, especially in Belgium. We have the burning of the Louvain Library, which was Europe's premier collection of medieval manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts. We have the rape of Belgium itself, which tipped the scales, as it were, for the British public to support Britain entering the war. Yeah? And then we have also the execution of Belgian civilians and a whole host of other stories as well. Later on in the war, in 1917, when the Germans withdrew from the Somme area at the beginning of 1917, they razed the entire area to the point where it was called by the British the devastated zone, by the French the zone rouge. And such was the damage caused. Every house, every well, every fruit tree was destroyed. And this was seen, again, as evidence of German frightfulness. So Scarborough both sets up and sits within a context of this notion of German barbarism and atrocity. And it creates this impression as Germany as the barbaric enemy of, conversely, decency, of, if you like, freedom and justice, values championed by the British people. Now, I'm not going to get into a world here of like, Rob, you must be extraordinarily naive if you do not think this was manipulated by the government, because of course it was. But that still does not detract from the fact that this is how people felt. Just because the government, is using this for their own ends doesn't actually diminish what people felt and thought themselves. And this also added a lot of credence to the British claim to be fighting against German militarism. Press photography had improved dramatically, so pictures came alongside the stories themselves, and you can see the damage involved. And for that reason, Britain's fighting against German militarism and for the liberal values underpinning democracy, those values not a million miles away from the decent values of America itself. Now, the German counter-propaganda effort is crude and extremely counterproductive. They are not playing on an even playing field. When I looked at the Cincinnati papers, which were German-produced papers, they had this sort of 2 or 3 vague attempts to try and stem the tide of anger about this throughout America, and they don't really have the outlets to do so. But the basis of their propaganda effort is also crude. Germany, they claim, is fighting a war of national survival, and therefore illegal invasion of Belgium is legitimate. This is not going to wash when you see images of thousands of refugees and the setting up of Belgian relief funds everywhere. Scarborough, according to the German maps, was a defended locality and therefore a legitimate target. That defended locality was apparently your castle, which is hardly what you call one of the most powerful defensive bastions of the East Coast. So clearly, Germany, this is a weak excuse. Clearly, this is a civil area. And Belgian civilians are all terrorists, this fear of what they call the franc-tireurs, which they first met back in 1870, in the 1870 war, and their fear of being shot by locals themselves. It was way over the top, this fear, and it saw a good deal of executions taking place. But again, the Germans argued that this was entirely legitimate, these were terrorists, and therefore could be executed. What the rest of the world saw was ordinary men and women who were being executed by a rapacious Germany. And this continual coverage of the Scarborough funerals that came afterwards, the rebuilding of Scarborough itself, the idea of these plucky Yorkshire tykes, which is an idea alien to me because I'm a Lancashire lad, and all the rest of it allow this story, provide it with a mechanism to run and run, and in turn it allows therefore for discussion in the letters columns, creating a forum, if you like, for pro-British sentiment. All of these are a consequence of Scarborough. These are from the New York Times. We've got the socialists extol the Times view of the war. That's not the British Times, that's the New York Times. There. When the Bernhardis govern the world, no chance then for any but German supermen, says Anthony Hope. Von Bernhardi was arguing this war of national survival, this war of all-out warfare itself, which feeds neatly into this idea of culture versus decency. And also fears of a German invasion. Britain first, America next. So it allows for discussion. It allows, therefore, a forum of debate to take place, which is bigger and beyond the stories themselves. So Scarborough is far more than the sum of its parts. It's far more than just a mere coastal raid. It's gone global. It's gone viral. If it was today, it'd be a YouTube massive hit. Now, moving on from the international dimension, I'm going to look at another element of total war, which again is directly connected with Scarborough. Now, the raid destroys the profound distinction between civilian and soldier. War is no longer being fought at some distance, at a remove, in a faraway place, but right here at home. This is the first time, if you like, for Britain, certainly within the last 300 years, where the civilian population, the non-combatants, were physically separated from the actual combat itself. Now they are linked together, and they are legitimate targets as well. So we are now really all in it together. It is a people's war and a people's cause. The moral dimension to this reinforces this ideological dimension, and ideology is important in motivating the mass into warfare itself. It is liberal democracy against barbaric German militarism. If you like, we can see this as a kind of proto-version of what happens in the Second World War, where it becomes democracy versus fascism and Nazism. Remember Scarborough becomes a very memorable recruiting slogan. Indeed, one of the, you can see one of the posters, a classic Remember Scarborough, enlist now. And with the threat of Zeppelin attacks as well, it means that a Scarborough could happen to you anywhere. It could happen to you and yours. We have an example there, if you like. This is from the Sussex, this one. Save Sussex from this. This is all directly influenced by Scarborough, and indeed it's about recruitment. Now, this adds a significant boost to numbers of men who are volunteering, and I've decided now to just dive off away from this large-scale appreciation to look at just one man for a moment, mostly because I think it's a very tragic story, and also because of this parallels between transition from limited to total war. Christopher Bennett, at number 2 Wickham Street. Wycombe Street or Wickham Street? Wycombe, thank you very much. Now, Bennett was the hero of number 2 Wycombe Street tragedy that saw 4 of his family killed by a single shell. Despite his best efforts, he lost his mother, who had lost a hand as well. You know, it's quite an awful scene of carnage there. His brother and 2 children who were staying there. Now, the photograph of the damage at 2 Wycombe Street became the image that sums up German frightfulness and becomes familiar to global audiences. There it is. That's the house itself. You can find that printed across newspapers in Russia, in Italy, in China, and, of course, in Middle America. It becomes symbolic. It's just an ordinary house destroyed by this high-tech German shell. And, indeed, the British lost no time in milking this to the maximum. It was turned into a highly successful recruiting poster that directly challenged the male population of Britain by playing on the loss of their women and children. Effectively, it says, Men of Britain, will you stand for this? And then we have, if you like, an illustrated version of it. And it gives you a list of 78 women and children killed. No, there's no male victims of this, it's just the women and children. Yeah? And effectively, it's saying to British men, are you man enough to go out there and defend your wives, your children, your mothers, your daughters against this German barbarism? Now, Bennett, who was the hero of this, ends up eventually joining the Royal Field Artillery as a driver in C Battery of 317th Brigade, 63rd Royal Naval Division. Now, those numbers are important. The reason why they're numbers is we see 317th Brigade because of the expansion of the artillery in this great artillery war. The bombardment of Hartlepool is artillery-based, and indeed the breaking of the trench lock on the Western Front will be done by ever greater amounts of artillery. And so it's interesting that he's ended up joining the artillery, which is to be the weapon of war, which will eventually crush the German army. Also, on top of that, he's in the 63rd Royal Naval Division. When Britain goes to war in 1914, we have 7 divisions in the front line. That's the British Expeditionary Force. By the time we get to 1917, that number's increased to 60, as well as commitments all around the globe. This is total war, and now we see Christopher Bennett, who's now caught up in it. But to pile up tragedy upon tragedy, Bennett himself was killed on the 21st of January 1917, and he's buried in Pouchevillers Cemetery. So he becomes eventually a victim of this war himself, but under very, very different circumstances. All of these victims can be named as individuals. By the time we get to 1917 and this gigantic total war, Bennett becomes just another one of the fallen, of the sacrificed themselves. I'm going to approach now the limits of Remember Scarborough, because it can only take us so far. Now, the recruitment figures for January 1915, which is the ones that will actually demonstrate any effect from Scarborough itself, saw a marked improvement of 40,000 over the previous month. So it did actually have an effect. There was a significant increase and boost to the recruiting. But within just a couple of months, that begins to die down. And the long-term effect of Remember Scarborough is quite difficult to quantify. But either way, the reality of total war meant that voluntary recruitment could not supply the soldiers needed. It's a profound British idea. It speaks to British liberalism, the idea of a volunteer army stepping up, Britain's best to do the right thing. But from a total war point of view, it's a ridiculous and daft way to organise your manpower. Now, so it was a cherished liberal principle, but it was an inefficient way to recruit, not just in terms of getting the numbers, but also in terms of allocating men to their various tasks. Again, Professor Doyle noted about the idea of exemptions during the First World War for skilled men. What we see in 1914, certainly nearly in 1915 as well, is that those skilled men are being sucked up and become just privates in battalions, when actually they're needed elsewhere to drive the transformation of Britain forward to fight this war. So it's interesting that throughout 1915, Britain begins to move towards compulsory service. It's going to ditch one of its cherished principles, about which it's been arguing for the previous 20 years, the idea of a national service versus voluntary service. And indeed, in January of 1916, the Military Service Act, which made participation compulsory, was passed. And here we have a copy of it there. You're being given until Thursday, March of 2nd, to get yourself registered and get yourself done. Otherwise, you're going to be picked up and taken straight away. This is a profound move from this voluntary principle, which we see Scarborough and the phrase "Remember Scarborough" being used, into one of a nation at arms. So there we see some of the limits of Scarborough as well. Another limit of Scarborough, as it were, another attitude that required changing, was the notion of business as usual. Now, in the aftermath, the people of Scarborough resolved to carry on. Indeed, a good deal of press ink is used to describe how they're rebuilding themselves, the fact that they refuse to be cowed by all of this, and that they will continue and carry on, as it were. And in that way, they echo the words of the Prime Minister Asquith, that it would be business as usual in Scarborough, come rain, come shine, or come German shells. But the reality is, in Scarborough, and in Britain and throughout the globe, it would not be business as usual. Very much not business as usual. We see there a line of sandbags across one of the main streets in Scarborough there. And those sandbags are, generally speaking, not a normal feature of a seaside town, unless, of course, you go to Blackpool, but that has a particular issue on a Friday night. Now then, so 1915, or rather Scarborough and the events of the Western Front, because remember this takes place simultaneous to the failure of any side to create a decision and the creation of trench lock in December of 1914, where we see trenches running from the Swiss border right up to the coast in Belgium, and the realization that to break through this is going to require a much bigger, more colossal effort. And it demonstrated this need, therefore, to apply the full organised energy of Britain to this business of war. And so 1915 was the year when it all changed and Britain really, truly becomes a nation at arms. And arms means guns, 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 guns. It's one of my favourite quotes. It's from Robocop. This is a high-end academic text that should be read by everybody. Now, both the Scarborough Raid and the events of the Western Front demonstrated, above all, the power of massed modern artillery. It is the giant guns that will become the principal weapon of the war. Not machine guns, not the will and bravery of men, but the scientific application of mass artillery and the shells and logistical systems used to supply them. Now, Britain was simply unprepared for this. Indeed, we're in a situation where as early as October 1914, the government is asking the large railway companies who have some spare capacity to start constructing gun carriages and replace the brakes on the worn-out general service wagons that they've got. This then becomes a demand for, certainly by November of 1914, a demand for prosthetics, the large railway companies having some expertise in this area. So already it's clear that Britain simply can't do this. The first request for the construction of shells, not the filling, but certainly the actual body of the shell itself, comes at the very end of November. So we can already see right from the very beginning that Britain is not prepared for this at all. Now, in May of 1915, the shell scandal broke in the press. A chap called Colonel Allacourt Repington, he was a scurrilous chap. He reported to the Times, in a great big splash there, about the fact that the British guns in France and Flanders had no shells. They were literally running out. They were restricted to firing no more than 4 a day. The Battle of Neuve-Chapelle was designed around the fact that we didn't have enough shells, and that a long bombardment to destroy and reduce the German defences there would have been somewhat embarrassing, as we lob over one shell every 15 minutes, hence the decision to throw them all together in a whirlwind barrage, which ironically was going to be the way forward, but at the time they didn't realise it. Also in the Battle of Loos, one of the reasons we use gas is because we simply don't have enough artillery and we don't have enough shells. And back home, it had been stories of daring do on the Western Front, of plucky soldiers fighting against gigantic odds. So when this became quite clear that actually we were handicapping our chances, while we have Prime Minister Asquith talking about business as usual when it most clearly not, then this leads inevitably to the fall of Asquith, the rise of Lloyd George, and the formation of the Ministry of Munitions, the largest buying and selling concern in the world. Now, the Ministry of Munitions was the instrument, the means by which Britain's total war effort was directed and expanded. It's almost impossible to give a sense of just how deeply embedded in every aspect of British industry, British society, security, intelligence, even social and cultural issues the ministry became involved in. It looked after police, it provided factories, it provided work for women, it was involved in intelligence, in spying, in working in assessing morale around the country. It was really a gigantic spider-like organisation, which was the expression of total war. It really was the nation in arms now. Now, eventually that ministry and the war itself would reach into every home, just as the war had initially reached into the homes of Scarborough. Now, in conclusion, there you go, Bob, wasn't bad for me. Scarborough was both a beginning and an end. It was far more than just a raid. It was far more than just the damage that was caused. It was a rude awakening that resonated around the world. And it was also an event that marked the passage from one world to another. That passage was from limited to total war, and the effect of this should not be underestimated. The two wars of this century have very much defined Britain, they've defined Europe, and they've defined the globe. They have defined just about everything that we do and understand now. So, in effect, what we've done, referring back to that photograph up there, is moved from remember Scarborough to feed the guns. Thank you very much.
Thank you.